Before we go too far with Active Directory, I want to give you a real quick visual overview of some of the terminologies and the way Active Directory is organized and the way we implement it, because you will hear these things, and this is one of those things it's just better to have a visual to understand exactly what they're talking about when you hear these terms. So let's start off with the first thing. You install Windows Server 2008 or Server 2003 or Windows Server 2000 onto a box, and you promote that box to become a domain controller. Now the instant you do that, you create a domain. Now most charts and graphs that you'll see pertaining to Active Directory are going to represent domains as a triangle. So that's why you'll see those that way. Now once I create this domain, it has a name. Okay, and for example, I named domain might be Nashville. So now any other domain controllers that we put in that domain can join it and transfer information back and forth. But let's do something different. We're now going to have our clients, which are running XP or Vista, and they are going to be able to connect to this domain controller because they're members of the domain. Then we can install other domain controllers, and these provide fault tolerance. And each of these domain controllers are part of this domain. There is no master domain controller. They're all just domain controllers. And these guys all replicate information around back and forth between themselves. Now, it's interesting to note, it does not matter how much distance is between these machines. All we need is a constant, reliable, high-speed connection between these. Now, high speed meaning 500K or better. Not tremendously high speed, but for most cases nowadays we're talking broadband type access. But so we install these machines. These could be different parts of the world, different parts of the state, doesn't matter. Then with our clients now, this is a domain, and you will also hear about organizational units, because let's think about something else here. As I start to put more and more clients into this domain, managing those clients becomes problematic. These guys are all in the sales department, and I need them to have certain permissions, certain regulations, certain aspects to their desktop or Internet Explorer that are different from these guys over here because they're in accounting. Okay, and so we can put them in an organizational unit. And then a little bit later on, we'll talk in another video about group policy and how we can apply group policy either at the domain level, which means every computer gets it, or at the individual OU. So we can create different ones for the different OUs. So an OU, or an organizational unit, is just a grouping of computers for administrative purposes only. It does not affect anything else about the computer other than just how we're going to work on it administratively. Now, let's go to the next level with this. I can also create sites. Now, a site can actually cross domains. A site is totally independent of itself, but the best way to understand sites is that within this whole domain, I have network connections between all of these computers. Okay, just picture, Cat5 cable running between all these computers and connecting them, right? Well, let's say that this domain controller and these clients are on a section or a subnet of the network that are either far away from these other ones, or there's not a real reliable network link between this group of computers and all these other ones. That's going to be problematic. For example, with Active Directory replication, with these computers, we don't want this one to try to reach across a wide area of slow link and authenticate to this server and so forth. So what we can do is we can put all of these machines into a site, and we identify our sites by our IP subnets. So if you'll think that you match your site to your IP subnet, now you'll understand how we're going to group these things. So let me review here. We've got a domain right here, and a domain basically is the fence for the general security layout for everybody inside there. The domain is protected. You can't join the domain or access resources in the domain unless you first log into the domain on one of these domain controllers. Then we can subdivide the objects and computers within our domain by using organizational units, and we group those for administrative purposes. We can have as many as we would like, and we can even nest organizational units inside organizational units. Okay, then based on the network infrastructure, we can put various sites in here, and to make somebody a member of a site, you go into the Sites tool, and you identify the site, the site name, and then the IP infrastructure that pertains to that site. Okay, now that's a domain, organizational unit, and a site. You can create another domain, and once you have more than one domain, you now have a forest. This is two separate domains. If these domains have a trust relationship between them, then they basically become a tree domain. Then, to make it a true forest, I can connect these domains. Now, this could be two totally separate domains. This could be Microsoft.com, and this could be, IRS.gov. That's a scary combination, isn't it? But if we connect those, they now become a forest, which means we have multiple domains in a single forest, and everything else applies just like before. And we can organize and manage these however we would like. So that's just a real quick overview of how Active Directory is laid out and how Active Directory looks theoretically in diagram form. Hope that helps. Now let's take a look at what's happened new in Active Directory in Windows Server 2008. Now, not surprising that with Active Directory being such an important part that it would get a fair share of improvements. The first one I want to talk about is auditing enhancements, and this is a really cool one. There's a new subcategory when you're auditing, and it's called Directory Service Changes. Now what this one does is it logs old and new values for AD domain services objects that have been changed. And this gives you a lot more ability to see exactly what's been going on your Active Directory domain. And this can really help, and we're going to talk about some other things a little bit later on in this video, when objects get deleted and then we need to do a restore on Active Directory to get some of these objects back, so we can see what's going on. The next one that's really cool is fine-grained password policies. Now, in Windows Server 2003, you had only one password policy and account lockout policy that you could apply to an entire domain. Well, that got kind of tough because sometimes you want to lock certain users for various reasons into a more stringent or a less stringent password policy and account lockout policy. Well, you know where I'm headed here. In Windows Server 2008, you can have multiple password and lockout policies that you apply to different users based on their membership in various groups, OUs, and that sort of thing. So that ability gives you a lot more flexibility for your password and lockout policies. And keep this in mind, domain admins by default can set these fine-grained policies. Now, those same permissions can be delegated to other people, but by default, just the domain admins group are going to be able to handle those things. Next up, and this is a big one, the read-only domain controller. Now, this thing's getting a lot of attention from a lot of people. It hosts only read-only partitions, or the read-only portion of the Active Directory database. Now notice what's missing there, which is the writable portion. Now the main thing that Microsoft is suggesting that you use a read-only domain controller for is where you have inadequate physical security conditions, yet you need to put a domain controller in that location. This would be a branch office, a separate floor, whatever, and maybe you've got applications that need to be running on a box that has Active Directory. The next reason that you'd have to do one of these is where you have remote or branch offices that have poor network bandwidth. Now a lot of times those two conditions will go hand in hand. You have a remote office that has poor network bandwidth, but they're also kind of out, away from everybody. They also have inadequate physical security conditions around it. So since this thing's going to get read-only, but since nobody can really write changes to Active Directory, they really can't damage Active Directory. They can see what's going on. So it's not the total security solution here, but it's much, much better. So that's a read-only domain controller. That's an RODC. You will see that used quite a bit. This next one is absolutely huge. Restartable Active Directory domain services. You can now restart Active Directory without rebooting the server. Now this is huge. In your management console snap-in, you will see now the ability to stop and start Active Directory. Now that means that you can perform Active Directory maintenance. You can do offline defragmentations of the database without taking everything else down, without rebooting the server. DHCP, DNS, anything else that's running on the domain controller continues to work, not a problem, no hassles. But you can restart Active Directory on that machine without affecting these other services, and that's going to be absolutely huge for administrators. Now, the really cool thing is when you install Windows Server 2008 and you promote it to a domain controller, it automatically enables this functionality. You don't have to do anything. It just happens. It's just there, and it's just working. Next up is a new functionality that's called Snapshot Exposure. What's going on here is periodic snapshots are being taken of the AD objects. And so you get a report, or you find out that an administrator has inadvertently deleted some Active Directory objects that they need back now. In the old way of doing things in Active Directory at 2003 and before, we had to basically shut down Active Directory. We had to go into Active Directory restore mode and do a restore and tell it whether we wanted to overwrite everything or just add to and so forth. Now, with the periodic snapshots, we can determine which backup to use. Before, it was kind of hit or miss. You just kind of went in directory restore, you did a restore, and you're like, oh man, that's the wrong one. So you got to go back through the process and try another backup until you get it right. You can use the LDAP tool, LDP, to view the data in the snapshots. Now keep in mind, the Snapshot Exposure tool doesn't restore Active Directory. We're just going to use this functionality to determine exactly which restore we want to use when we do a restore of Active Directory. Okay, it's just kind of a tool that's added into that restore process to help us. Next thing is you're going to see some user interface improvements. There's an updated domain and services installation wizard that helps with the whole process of installing domain controllers. And then in various places in the MMC snap-ins, Active Directory users and computers and so forth, you're going to see some visual improvements and some logical improvements in the various windows and screens that you see and use there to administer Active Directory. So Active Directory got a pretty good facelift, and I think you're going to like what you find out there. Now let's take a look at creating a domain controller. So we've installed Windows Server 2008, and keep in mind, when Windows Server 2008 is installed, you get a bare bones box. Nothing's going on in this thing. So we're going to have to go in and give it the functionalities that we want. And the way we're going to do that, I'm going to talk you through it here, then we're going to actually go do it. You're going to open the Server Manager up, and then we need to add a role. And the role that we need to add is the Active Directory Domain Services. Now that just adds the role to the box, but then we have to actually promote that particular box to an Active Directory Domain Controller. So we're going to run DC promo. Okay? So having said that, let's go actually do this and let you see what it looks like. So here I am at the desktop, and I will click Start and go into the Server Manager. And what I'm looking for here is the ability to add roles. So you can see if I click on roles right here, this box was just installed. There are no roles. 0 of 16 roles have been added, so I will click on Add a Role, and this kicks off the Add Roles wizard. Now this explains what's going on and what I need to be able to run the wizard. I can click here to skip this page by default. I'll leave it on for now. Notice the roles that I have to choose from. I'm going to choose the Active Directory Domain Services, and then I'll choose Next. And then it's going to give me some information here. It's going to explain what Active Directory does. Then things to note: to help ensure users can still log on, install a minimum of 2 domain controllers for each domain. AD requires DNS server to be installed. If you don't have one, you'll be prompted to install one. After you install the ADS role, you'll need to use the Active Directory Domain Services installation wizard to make it a fully functional domain server, and it'll also install the DFS namespace replication and file replication services that are required by Active Directory. I'll click Next here, and they're reminding me again to do the DC promo. I will click install here and let it begin to install the role. Now the reason they keep reminding me about DC promo, if you're new to the Windows Server operating system, then you're gonna the big deal there is that in previous versions, all you had to do in previous versions of the server operating system to make a box a domain controller was to just run the DC promo. And so now we're having to actually install the role. And they're wanting to make sure that we don't forget the step of DC promo. Installing the role won't do the whole trick, and so we're going to have to take care of that. So as you notice, this thing's installing. Maybe it's been running about a minute now, and so we'll let this thing run. Keep in mind, Microsoft's going to recommend you have at least 2 domain controllers in every domain, and that is so that you have some fault tolerance in case you lose one, since these things are replicating the users, computers, and security and so forth to each other. Then even if one goes down, you still have that capability for your users. And so you notice we're getting close to the end of installing our domain services role here, and let's see what happens. We're running this is about a minute and a half in. Okay, so we have installation results. The installation was successful for Active Directory Domain Services, and now it's saying that the Active Directory Domain Controller service was installed. We need to use DC promo. I can close this wizard and launch the Active Directory Services installation wizard, DC promo. So I will click that link and it will close that, and there's the Active Directory Domain Services installation wizard. Okay, notice I can use an advanced mode installation. I'm going to skip that for now. This is telling me about operating system compatibility. I'm going to create a new domain in a new forest, or if I were joining an existing forest, I could click here, or I could do a new domain in existing forest and then connect the forest. But I'm going to do a new domain in a new forest, and then I can type the fully qualified domain name. I'm going to call this box Nashville.tn. It's going to check to see if it sees this forest out there on my network anywhere. Verifying my NetBIOS name. Now, the forest functional level we'll talk about in a later video, but this is where we're going to set this. Okay, Windows 2000, 2003, or 2008. We're going to select 2008 and go on past. Then we can select additional options, a DNS server, and it's telling me that this has a dynamically assigned IP address, and you shouldn't do that. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do that because of my training environment here. And then it's going to ask me where I want to put my databases for Active Directory. It's going to ask me for a password for this box. Let me put one in, and that password will have to meet complexity requirements. And now Active Directory is going to install DNS and install Active Directory. So what I'm going to do now is pause the video and let this complete, and then close it out and give you a couple of things to think about. So we're still running. It's been running, I don't know, maybe a minute or two. What I'm going to do is we'll stop the video here and we'll join you back in part 2, and we'll look at the completion of installing Active Directory and the changes that it makes. Okay, in part 2 of installing a domain controller, we're going to continue what we started in part 1. We added a role to a Windows Server 2008 installation, and the role was the domain services role. And then it kicked us off into the Active Directory Domain Services installation wizard, and we ran DC promo. Now you can also run DC promo by clicking on Start Run and just typing DC promo in there. But as you can see, the wizard, the DC promo portion of the installation wizard, is configuring Active Directory Domain Services. Now they're warning you right here, this process can take from a few minutes to several hours, depending on a lot of things, options you selected and so forth. And I have seen this thing before in a real world installation take quite a while to install, up to a couple of hours. So that's entirely possible to happen. But as you can see, it's creating directory partitions, creating objects, setting LSA policy information. It's just taking care of everything here. You don't have to do anything, just kind of get out of the way, find something else to do for a while. I'm going to pause the video and come back in just a couple of minutes and show you what exactly has happened with the installation of Active Directory Domain Controller. Here we are. The Domain Controller has been installed. To close the wizard, we're simply going to click Finish, and now it's going to tell us that we have to restart the computer before the changes will take effect. So I'm going to pause the video, restart the machine, and I'll be right back with you. Now you'll notice my server has rebooted, and so now I'm going to log in, and you'll notice that it sees my domain, Nashville Administrator, and I'll put the password in that I told it I wanted during the Active Directory promotion with DC Promo, and should take us in, and I'll show you a couple of things that have happened since we've become a domain controller. So it takes us to the desktop, and it's given me a warning here about my environment. Don't worry about that. And notice it takes us to the initial configuration tasks so that we can set things like time zone, configure networking, and so forth. Okay? And I'm going to skip that stuff. But notice that I can come down here. I can add roles, add features, enable remote desktop, configure the firewall, and so forth. I'm going to close that, and then it will kick off automatically for me the Server Manager. And you will see that pop up here in just a second. Okay, now you'll notice full computer name. We're now in the Nashville TN domain. We have IP version 4, and if I go in and start to look at some of the information in my Server Manager now, you'll notice a couple of changes. First of all, you'll notice nothing seems a whole lot different down in this area, but if I go into roles now, let me make this a little wider. You'll notice that now under roles I see the roles that have been installed. There's Active Directory Domain Services and the DNS Server. Now if I go under the Active Directory Domain Services snap-in and expand that, you'll see that there's an Active Directory Users and Computers. And if I expand that, you'll see my domain, and I expand that, and now I can see, for example, the users in my domain. I can see the computers that are in my domain. So far I haven't joined any client computers to my domain, and then I can see the domain controllers in my domain, and I only have this one right now. And notice I let Windows give it the name when I actually installed Windows Server 2008, and it's not a very user-friendly name, so I could go change that if I would like. But also, let's go take a look. It installed DNS, and it made some configurations for me. My forward lookup zones, and I can double click and go in and look around in these. So anyway, you can see that all this stuff happened. Now I am a fully functional domain controller. Okay, I've established a forest and a domain with a single controller. What I should do now, real world, is go establish a second domain controller, and when I do, join it to this domain, just point it to this domain, and it would begin replicating and keeping all these users, computer accounts, and so forth in there. Okay, so in these two videos, this one and the previous one, I've shown you how to take a standard Windows Server installation that comes in just as a bare bones box, add the Active Directory Domain Services role, and then promote that to be a fully functional domain controller. Setting the domain functional levels is something that you're going to get the opportunity to do when you establish a domain controller in any Windows Server environment. And I want to kind of go through the domain functional levels in Windows Server 2008 and explain exactly what they are. The way to think about a domain functional level is to think about the implementation of a domain in a medium to large company. Let's say you have 10 domain controllers out there. What's the chances that all these 10 domain controllers are going to be upgraded to Windows Server 2008 on the same day? Well, it's not very good, is it? So with domain functional levels, we can basically tell the domain how many, do you have Windows Server 2008 servers here, Windows Server 2003s, and we're going to have to agree on what functionalities are provided by these domain controllers across the domain. So we set those functional levels based on really kind of the lowest common denominator, if you will, for the servers, the domain controllers that we have in the domain. Now there are 3 functional domain levels in Windows Server 2008. The first one is Windows 2000 Native. Then we have Windows Server 2003. Then we have Windows Server 2008. Now let's take a look at each of these. Now I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. I just want you to see that these are out there, and then I'm going to show you how to set it. First of all, when I set the domain functional level, let's say that I install Windows Server 2008. I promote it to a domain controller by adding the domain services role and then running the installation wizard, which is DC Promo. It's going to ask me in there, what domain functionality level do you want to be running at? Now, if I have a domain controller in my domain that's running Windows 2000 server, then I'm going to have to set my domain functional level to Windows 2000. So, what functionalities do we have? Well, the Windows Server 2000 brought us universal groups, group nesting, group conversion was enabled, SID history, the security ID history. So anyway, we're going to set it to Windows Server 2000 if we have Windows Server 2000 boxes in our environment. Now, the Windows Server 2003 domain level obviously means that we have some domain controllers running Windows Server 2003. I strongly suspect that most Windows Server 2008 installations are going to run at the Windows Server 2003 functionality level for a while. Now, as you upgrade your Windows Server 2003 boxes to Windows Server 2008, once you've got them all on 2008, then you can go in and change the functionality level in Active Directory to Server 2008. Again, I'll show you how to do that in just a few seconds. What functionality do we get? Well, we get all the features from the Windows 2000 server level. Then we get things like the NetDOM tool that helped us prepare for a domain controller rename that made that process easier. We have the ability to redirect to users and computers containers. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on these. You can go out and read on them on the Microsoft site. Then the big one, the Windows Server 2008 domain functional level. This means all of your domain controllers in the domain are running Windows Server 2008. Now this is where Microsoft wants you to be, right? What functionality do you get for this? And it's interesting, you get all features from the Windows Server 2000 and 2003 level. You get distributed file system support for the sysvol. You get advanced encryption services, AES 128 and 256 support for the Kerberos protocol. And you get last interactive logon information. Now that one's kind of cool because what happens with that last interactive logon is that it tells you the last time that the user, the workstation, the user that logged in, what workstation they were on, the time it happened and so forth. It can really help you to know what's going on in your domain. And then notice this one, fine-grained password policies. Now this is one of the big kind of marketing things that Microsoft's proud of, but understand you don't get this in your domain until all your domain servers, all your domain controllers are running the Windows Server 2008 operating system. Now let's say that we just upgraded our last Windows Server 2003 box. How would we go in and change the domain functional level so that we get all the advanced features of Windows Server 2008? Well, let's go out to the desktop and I'll step you through that. Okay, I'm at the desktop and now let's go through the process of raising, or I'm going to show you where to raise the forest functional level. Notice I'm going to click on Start, and this time I'm going to go to Administrative Tools because we want to go into the Active Directory Domains and Trusts tool. One of the few times you will leave the Server Manager. So we open this tool up, and this lets me look at and make changes to my Active Directory domains and trust between those domains. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my domain, then I'm going to right click on the domain, and that can be, now let me point out something here, that can be tricky. There are places in these tools that if you just right click you don't see the same thing. So it's usually safe, most safe, to click on it, left click on it, and then select it, then right click on it. Okay, so left click to select it, then right click, and then raise the domain functional level. Now this is telling me that it's currently at the Windows Server 2008 level. If it wasn't at the Server 2008 level, it would give me some choices to choose. Okay, so that's how I do it. I'm going to go into Active Directory Domains and Trust, right click on my domain, and then set the current functional level. That's a domain functional level overview, and that's how to go about changing your domain functional level. Now, in a couple of places in other videos, I've mentioned read-only domain controllers. Now, this is one of the new additions to Windows Server 2008, and I want to talk a little bit about them here and make sure you understand what they're really for, and then just kind of some intricacies about them that you need to be aware of. First of all, when exactly would we deploy a read-only domain controller? Microsoft's suggestion is that they designed these to be used when basically physical server security cannot be guaranteed. Now, this usually goes hand in hand with poor network bandwidth or lower network bandwidth, but generally the bandwidth is not the real reason for doing a read-only domain controller. Think about a scenario here, that is where we've got a remote office. They may have poor bandwidth, okay, and that slows down logons and so forth to get back to a writable domain controller. So the solution is to put a fully writable domain controller out there in that location. The problem is it's away from our normal administrative duties. It's a branch office. We don't have a full-time, for lack of a better term, serious administrator out there. We're using a knowledgeable user that's on site. So we don't want to put a writable domain controller out there because somebody, because of the physical security aspect and the knowledge level aspect of our administrator, somebody might inadvertently cause some problems with Active Directory, because if they go in there and change Active Directory, it is a writable controller and it would replicate those changes throughout our Active Directory structure. So when a read-only domain controller takes that risk away because it can't be changed. Now, usually you will see these around few users. We'll talk about why in just a minute, and when the local admin has little knowledge of IT. Okay, so there's our scenario when we would use these. Now, how is this actually different from a domain controller? Well, it's more secure in that you can't make changes to Active Directory on it, but it is less functional. Now, it stores all of your Active Directory objects and attributes in a read-only state except passwords. And again, since the assumption here is that this thing is not in as physically safe an environment, we don't want to store passwords on there that could possibly be cracked and then used to penetrate the network somewhere else. Also, obviously, this cannot accept changes to AD. Any changes to AD, you have to connect to a writable domain controller elsewhere on the network, and then those changes get replicated back down to the read-only domain controller. Now, there is a technology employed here called credential caching, and this is where the read-only domain controller can store user or computer credentials locally on the machine. Now, it's only going to hold approximately 10 passwords at a time. Again, we don't want to put a bunch of passwords on this thing in a physically insecure location, have someone get into this box or maybe even just steal the box and then be able to try to penetrate and learn these passwords. So we're only going to have about 10 at a time on there, and this feature is not enabled by default. You'll have to go in and explicitly allow a domain controller to do credential caching, and then there will have to be permissions up in your Active Directory network on a writable domain controller to allow this to happen to this read-only domain controller. Now, there's something else that's really cool about these read-only domain controllers, and that is the ability to do administrator role separation. Let me talk about what that is. This is where we're going to delegate a read-only domain controller who has a local administrator role, and we're going to let them make changes, do administrative level type functionalities to the read-only domain controller, but they do not have any rights on our other writable domain controllers in the domain. This just gives them rights just to that read-only domain controller. Now, this way they can go in and change device drivers or make minor configuration changes to the box to help everybody get what they need to do done. But again, it keeps them off of the rest of the network. Now we can also install services like read-only DNS. So we can install the DNS server service on the read-only domain controller, and then it can actually pull down the full zones and read from them and resolve names. Now it can't do any updates. Any updates to DNS get sent back to a writable domain controller and then get replicated back down to the read-only. Now deploying a read-only domain controller, there's some things you're going to have to do, and I'm going to direct you back out to Microsoft's website. Do a search on read-only domain controllers and look at this before you set it up. There's a little bit involved. First of all, you'll have to have a domain controller already in your Active Directory network, and the domain controller that holds the PDC, or the primary domain controller emulator master operation role, has to be a Windows Server 2008 box. And then the read-only domain controller has to forward authentication requests to a Windows Server 2008 domain controller, and the domain functional level, which we discussed in a different video, must be Windows Server 2003 or higher. And then you'll have to run the AdPrep utility with the switch RODC prep once in the Active Directory forest. And this is going to make changes to Active Directory and give permissions for DNS and some other things for the domain controller, and to let the forest know that there's going to be a domain controller in there. So you'll only run that once anywhere in the Active Directory forest where the read-only domain controller is going to reside. So again, I just want you to understand this thing. The main thing to remember about a read-only domain controller is it's not just for poor bandwidth. It's really designed for poor security in remote locations.